Panellists, you'll have to nicely share those microphones, and I ask you to draw them rather close to you because we want to hear you all the way at the back. And I am serious. When I first saw this lineup, I thought, once again, an embarrassment of riches. Also, an unusual variety of perspectives. It would be very typical to have, a print, radio and television journo there, and that'd be great. We have gone above and beyond that for this panel. And panellists, we didn't get a chance for a briefing, so it's a free-for-all, goddammit. I'm going to throw some questions at you. You're going to answer them. These people, a warning, they're angry. Okay. So, even in this alleged social media age, media is absolutely fundamental to the way we perceive and understand anything, whether it be chemical weapons attacks in Syria or the Hazelwood mine fire. As much as we experience life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we still absorb a hell of a lot of it and create perceptions and understandings through our good old-fashioned TV, newspaper and radio, and online, of course. And through the ABC app. Are you happy now? Fine. So, oh my God, have you got enough provos for that yet? Anyway, so, it is clearly important, and that's why so many organisations and companies and government spend a lot of time, money and energy trying to shape the way media reports certain phenomena out there. We have a terrific panel ready for you, in no particular order. Dr. Denis Muller. Say hello, Denis. Make him welcome, folks. Denis is here. A man with a hell of a perspective on journalism. Worked in print for 27 years. Goodness me. At the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Has taught pretty much a generation of journalists. You must see their work each and every day, courtesy of your work at the University of Melbourne. Indeed, you've taught ethics and media law as part of the Masters of Journalism. Actually, that's something I must ask you about. There was a time where journalism was a trade. Unqualified, taking an urchin off the street and made into a journo, stuck up chimneys. There you are, teaching master's students ethics, but we will address that later, Denis. Just a warning. Nick McKenzie is with us, folks. Make Nick very welcome. Nick has, you've transcended The Age in Fairfax. We now see your work on ABC with those joint reports, Four Corners, Fairfax. How many people is it, Nick, that you've put in jail as a result of your work? And don't tell me you don't know the number, because if any of us put people in jail, we'd know the number. How many?
You're on your best behaviour today?
Yeah, this is me. Quite a few. Because it's very hard-hitting investigative journalism that Nick specialises in. And that's an endangered species of journalism. The investigative reporter who can spend a very long time and a lot of resources on a story. In fact, Nick, I did have a couple of headlines of your recent work regarding the MFB and the government's relations therein. Some of you might be familiar with it, but we won't go into those right now. Dr. Tom Doig is with us. Tom, make yourself known. Make Tom welcome, folks. This is the perfect perspective for this panel. You are a recently minted PhD, aren't you? Well, yes, a fresh doctor. You can actually, like new cars and babies, they have that smell. And Tom's freelance journalist and academic. He's written a couple of books. Okay, you've written books. Do you have to put in your bio? Fine. The coalface around the Hazelwood mine fire in the Latrobe Valley. And I know we have some non-Victorians here, and Tom will brief you on that fire because it was quite a particular sort of incident. And also, that PhD was in disaster literary journalism. All will be revealed later on. Anna Parle, make Anna welcome, ladies and gentlemen. When Anna was a little girl, you'd ask her what she wanted to be when she grew up, and she would say, the Victorian State Chief Resilience Officer and Director of the Community Resilience and Social Inclusion Branch at Department of Premier and Cabinet. What a coincidence, that is exactly what she has become. And this is, again, that unusual perspective on a panel such as this, and we had a brief chat before, and now I understand why you are here and government's interest in the media, and you will reveal all, Anna, in just a moment. And Sascha Rundle joins us. Make Sascha very welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Manager, Diversity, Emergency and Strategy with the ABC. Sascha, is there any equivalent of you and your position in any commercial media outlet in this nation?
I would think not.
You would think not, because only the ABC would be concerned with such issues. That's why we hold you to a higher standard, of course, and that is the burden of working for the ABC. So these are our panellists, folks. Microphones coming to you if and when you have a question, and we hope you do. Folks, we've asked you to think about how you cover disaster, emergency, with a special interest on diversity and inclusion. Is this anything that journalists and the media think about at any point in time during their real working lives? Anyone? Panel, it's over to you.
No.
And that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much. I'll take both answers. Denis?
Well, I'm a bit of an old shellback. I mean, I haven't been in newspaper since 1993, but certainly when I covered the Blue Mountains bushfires in the 70s at the Sydney Morning Herald, the main job was to get the story in the paper. And so the focus was on getting where the action was, talking to survivors, talking to emergency services people, and filing the story. And the concept of diversity didn't cross my mind. And then later, as a news executive on The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, I'm sure I never asked a reporter to explore issues of diversity when they were covering a disaster of any kind.
Gosh, what did you do all day? Oh, that's right,
Yeah.
get the story.
Got the paper out was the idea.
Thank you for that honesty. And I presume diversity wasn't a big issue within the newsroom either.
More so at The Age, actually, than at the Sydney Morning Herald. There was quite a culture at The Age, even in the 1980s and 90s, around gender diversity, certainly. And then later, diversity more broadly, concerning people with disabilities and so on. So there was much more of a culture at The Age than at the Herald.
Sascha, you had a contrary experience or opinion?
I think up until about 5 years ago, my answer would have been exactly the same. When I think back to some of the early emergencies I covered as a journalist, floods and fire and the like, certainly diversity just was not a part of it. That was not a part of getting the story. We wanted to get the story, we wanted to get it right and be accurate and make sure it was out in a timely fashion, but we didn't consider how we were representing different parts of Australia. What I would say is that over the past 5 years, as the necessary push for greater diversity and inclusion within media reporting has come to the fore, I've actually seen that change the level of reporting for emergencies and disasters. I'm thinking back, I think it was last year, the Adelaide Hills flooded, and we specifically went out, the ABC specifically went out and sought the Vietnamese farmers who were so drastically affected by those floods. We tried to capture their side of the story as part of the overall storytelling of that particular emergency. So we are starting to see it now, and I think it's it's absolutely overdue.
Dick, any thoughts on that?
No, please. No.
Not interested unless you can nab someone and put if you can destroy an entire industry with the 40-minute report.
Just even being invited to the conference made me reflect on my sort of lack of experience dealing with these issues. I've been a reporter for 17 years, and it's probably with some embarrassment that I'd confess that it hasn't entered my day-to-day. It's been, certainly in the last 5 years, more talked about, but I think, like many of the agencies you guys work for, the challenges are bleeding through to the boots on the ground staff, which has not been overly successful. In fact, probably pretty hopeless in most of the media. Certainly the commercial TV media would be absolutely disastrous, I would imagine. We do still work in the media in quite often male-dominated hierarchies, and I'm part of that. I'm part of that hierarchy, and we're probably less self-reflective than public sector agencies, because you guys are having the Human Rights Charter and different programs implemented, and that's not happening as far as I can see in the media space, partly because we can't fund it. The media's in financial crisis, so that's certainly affecting our ability to take in these things that are perhaps long been considered outside core value. But also what's opened my eyes to the issue is reporting on emergency services over many years, and two really quick things. About 12 years ago, the police force went through what the fire services are going through now, and I got to meet many female. I know many female police officers, junior and senior. Some of them have become good friends, and they told me about their experiences dealing with these sorts of issues. And then I've recently encountered it the last year or two across the fire services, and that's been a huge eye-opener for me as an individual, but also understanding how sort of entrenched the problems are in your industries, but also in my industry.
Please, Tom.
Yeah, so I'll just speak specifically to the 2014 Hazelwood mine fire, which occurred about an hour and a half east of here in the Latrobe Valley. And so that's an event that I covered as other fires. I might check up a couple of slides really quickly. We'll see if this
Thanks,
Matt can work. So yeah, I covered it in the moment. Yeah, so this is a very small segment of a brown coal mine that caught on fire 400 metres away from a town of 14,000 people, the town of Morwell. It was actually a 130 metre high coalface. That's only about a quarter of it. So yeah, that's where the mine is in relation to Melbourne. The dark grey is Hazelwood, the light grey is Morwell. That's the aerial view. So you can't really tell where the mine ends and the city, the mine begins. And that's where the fire was. And yeah, the result was that and that and that. So it was crazy. In the initial coverage, I think everyone was just trying to get the story and talk to anyone who was, brave, foolish enough to be walking the streets, and those diversity issues weren't front and centre. And for me, the first story I wrote, I was just trying to talk to whoever I could. But I've since, written a PhD and a book or short book, and now I'm writing a longer book of narrative journalism on the issue. And when I went back to the story, back to the community for months and years, those diversity issues became front and centre. And the gender stuff is one thing, and clearly I feel like disaster coverage skews to gendered representations of victims as often female and domestic, and then heroes is male. In terms of firefighters, emergency services, and Hazelwood workers. And it's not always the case, and I guess in the Latrobe Valley some of the exceptions were some of the sort of community activists who came through. One of them, Tracy Lunder's sitting right there. So yeah, Tracy's great. But I think class is one of the big difficult stories to tell in the Latrobe Valley and across Australia more generally. And I think one of the things that I've really focused on in my longer work is trying to sort of unpack how entrenched disability around poverty affects disaster responses. And I think that's something that's incredibly difficult for journalists to do on the day-to-day basis.
You're in a room of people who may be very aware of that, but there is a terrific story you told me just before. Yeah,
so paradigmatic story is Julia Browell, who is this woman who is a long-term ME sufferer, so myalgic encephalitis, on a sickness benefit. Her partner died about 6 months before the fire. She can't drive. When the fire hit, she was not able to evacuate. Her disability pension didn't come through for about the first 10 days of the mine fire, so she literally had to eat vegetables out of her garden that were getting poisonous ash landing on them. There were roadworks going on her street that continued, which meant she had no water, so she literally couldn't wash her poisoned vegetables. And so that kind of experience is sort of almost inconceivable, and it took me, years of investigation so I can get my head around how that kind of stuff works. And so I guess I guess that's where long-form journalism can sort of intervene in it. But my book's only going to be read by a few thousand people, and its reach is going to always be very different to what goes on in the major dailies.
Please.
Yeah.
Just make a point, I guess, from a government perspective. As we've seen the media landscape change over the last 10 years and looking at diversity and inclusion, we've also seen the priority level that government gives to diversity and how it intersects with social cohesion. And I guess what I mean by that is disaster can bring out the best in communities, and it can also bring out the worst in communities. And you've all seen it for at different times for different reasons. So my remit, I advise government on issues relating to social cohesion and the prevention of violent extremism. So I'm probably a little bit more narrow in my scope in terms of anything that may escalate to violent extremism being, say, a terrorist attack, and how diversity is represented in community, and then and what that looks like. So how media reporting and media report disaster and diversity in disaster can actually help government policy or hinder government policy.
And of course, that sounds good. It sounds positive. But to a journalist or media or people who like freedom of speech, damn it, we might be concerned about the way government wants to influence the way media reports some long-burning issues with complicated issues of poverty and disaster and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, how healthy is it for our democracy that the media is actively being manipulated, or the government is at least trying to actively manipulate media in the way they cover and what they do and don't cover? I know you would never use that word, and that's to you.
Look, I think, actively manipulate, that is an incredibly strong term. I think
I'm not afraid to use it.
I think you've got to look at push and pull factors when you're dealing with social cohesion. And if I'm talking in relation to, say, if there was a terrorism incident, if you have a marginalised community that is already marginalised, which already has push and pull factors operating around it, and why is that community closing down? What is pushing them out of their cohort, or what is pulling them or making them vulnerable to, say, extremist messaging? Now, we're not saying don't report the facts, but I think there can be negative or exacerbation of negative reporting around certain cohorts in the community, which actually, from a social cohesion perspective, don't always help if we're trying to stem attractiveness to really, ideology that doesn't really support social cohesion. So it's a very fine balance, but I don't think that anyone's got it right on either side yet, but, we just have to be really mindful, I think, of when we are looking at media reporting in disaster.
Yeah, look, I pick up on that, if I may, Brett.
Could I just ask you to... Thank
you.
Yeah. Thanks, Sascha.
It is an abiding weakness of our profession that we do tend to look for simple ways of telling stories, and part of simplifying stories is to create heroes and villains, black hats and white hats, stereotypes of every description.
You talk to me about the model or the template for reporting almost any type of story.
Yeah.
With disaster.
Yeah.
What's the template? What are the elements?
All right. First, the rationale for that is if you don't have routines for these things, you go mad.
Yep.
Okay? So if you have a Black Saturday or some major disaster, the first phase is the flame phase, the action phase. What's burning, where, what's the death toll, how many houses have been destroyed. That's the first story you want. The second story is the response story. What was the response like? The third phase is what next? And then the fourth is the blame. And that's the kind of sequence. That's the way it plays out. Now, the blame thing is a question of timing. Here in Melbourne, after Black Saturday, the local media, all of the local media, stayed away from the blame game for 10 days, a bit longer. The Australian and the Financial Review, based in Sydney, were into it in the first week. The local community weren't ready for it. Okay, but so the last bit, the blame thing, has got a kind of it's like comedy, tragedy plus time. But those other phases are absolutely locked in. If you send reporters out to cover a big disaster on day one, you want the story of the disaster. That's what you need. That's what the public expect of you. If you don't do that, you're not fulfilling your social obligations. So don't get ahead of yourselves. Get your priorities right, get your resources in to fulfil those priorities, and then let the story unfold.
Tom, you mentioned about one of the aspects of Hazelwood that was unusual is that very long timeline. You have some thoughts on that?
Yeah. Look, I would also just like to jump in on what Denis was saying, is that if we go event, response, what next, and blame, what can drop out of that is any in-depth analysis of pre-existing vulnerability and causes, basically.
Yep.
Like, blame and causes can be completely different. So with Hazelwood mine fire, the Denis Napthine government was trying to just blame an arsonist, and then trying to sort of wrap the story up as it was the fault of an arsonist, not 70 years of terrible industrial planning and bad regulation. And in terms of time, I think for the Hazelwood mine fire, one of the things that was incredibly difficult for daily reporting to wrap its head around is the fact that this was a 45-day disaster, so it was 1,000 hours in a row. And so, but everyone was going into it, myself included, with the bushfire frame. So you go, okay, it's a bushfire. It lasts for a day or two and then it's over. And the emergency services were using the bushfire frame. A month later, it was still burning and people were still suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning, and it was extraordinarily difficult. And the emergency response was really terrible because of that as well. People sort of weren't encouraged to evacuate the way they maybe should have.
In keeping that story alive, didn't they? They made it a story and made it continue to be a story for an extended period, far beyond the usual time. They did.
But it's literally a structural weakness. It's not a fault of any one journalist that you can't, in an 800-word news story or a 3-minute news clip, explain what the lived experience of 1,000 hours of toxic smoke and disorientation and poisoning is. And that's where, I guess, sociology and literary journalism can come in, because you can spend 100,000 words on it and do that kind of stuff.
Thoughts, queries, questions from the floor? Welcome. Anna and Sascha, we've mentioned social cohesion, which is a phrase that doesn't get mentioned as often as it used to, I think. And allow me to ask you the question, are we at risk, in the interest of social cohesion and not blaming people who are often held to blame, are we at risk of politically correct reporting where we don't address certain issues around poverty or identity or ethnicity or religion or anything? Are we at risk of being a little bit too gentle with our reporting in the interests of being diverse and inclusive?
I don't think so in the nature of reporting disasters. I don't think that's an issue. I think we do need to be mindful of it. And I also think there's a difference between the actual reporting of disasters, which Denis and Tom have described, as opposed to the role the media plays as an emergency broadcaster. Now, the ABC is an emergency broadcaster. We've never said that we are the exclusive emergency broadcaster, because there are countless other media organisations who do that role in the time of emergency. So, for example, where the news journalists are having, I guess, a single-day approach to a disaster, and possibly in that time frame not even thinking about social cohesion, by day 2, if they're thinking who is to blame, how are we going to point the finger at someone, they're certainly not thinking about the impact that will have on that particular impacted community, the community affected by the disaster. We know from our work with psychologists the nature of that term cleavage, which is in the days after an emergency, a community will, from a very human basis, try to find someone to blame, to help release some of the emotions and the trauma that they have gone through. So the media and journalists may help to play into that. Emergency broadcasters, when they do it well, should absolutely step away from that. And for example, an emergency broadcaster should be working before, during and after that disaster, working hand in hand with the emergency agencies. And I know, as far as the ABC goes, with our emergency broadcast team, the first thing we need to consider is to give the audience the information they need so they can decide how they will respond to that emergency event. If there are any suggestions of, someone lit the fire, or an organisation's power lines fell down, or whoever started that particular emergency event, we don't go near them. We specifically do not go near those issues. We know that in the weeks to come, absolutely, that's the time for a proper investigation into the cause of that emergency, but not during the stage of emergency itself.
I do want to ask the panel, and I'll get about who you do and don't speak to, how they are and are not treated, but I know you have some thoughts.
Just really quickly, on the issue of social cohesion in government, if you look at what is the role of government in this space. Now, a socially cohesive society, a connected society is a resilient society. A resilient society can function. So it is actually the role of government to be protecting social cohesion, and it is the role of media to be, it doesn't always work in a perfect world, and it is the role of media to be reporting facts. So I think there is always going to be that natural tension. But yeah, look, are we being too politically correct in our reporting in the name of social cohesion? It's a really hard one, but I just think we've got to, there's things government can say, there are things government can't say, and social cohesion is something that just need to keep working towards.
Can I spot in really quickly? I mean,
By all means. Yep.
as a daily practitioner, and so you guys have deep expertise in specific areas, but I'm in the media every day, and I work across both Fairfax and the ABC. The social cohesion, that's not coming into daily reporting. The media, and a lot of it, I don't like to bag the media because the media does a hell of a great task much of the time, but let's be frank, I mean, come an emergency, the media moves in like a vulture, and it's not. The concepts you guys are discussing are absolutely foreign to 90% of the media. And, really, it should be the media sitting out here where you guys are sitting, hearing from the practitioners saying, guys, have you thought about reporting like this? Because people do not think that. They cover the disaster, they move on to the next disaster. If you're in telly, you get your pictures. I mean, I know my bias is when I work on Four Corners and when I find, the most appealing victim. That sounds terrible, but who can I humanise to get the emotional impact? So
What are you looking for in that victim, Nick?
Well, I mean, to lay it bare, it tends to be, you never see after a disaster, policing, fire services, whatever the case may be, the hero tends to be a bloke covered in soot, and the victim tends to be a woman with a baby, and that's the way we report almost always. And I will look for the, we look for victims, and we don't empower them. They're our victims. We want to get them to evoke emotion, and then we move on to the next disaster. And so we're not, the baseline's pretty bad, I think, at our end.
Thank you for your brutal honesty, Nick.
I'd just like to,
And that's a 7-time Walkley Award winner speaking, ladies and gentlemen.
I'd like to actually say something in defence of the media, although it's so much more fun to bag them, but I actually think that the media did a fabulous job with Hazelwood, and especially ABC Gippsland and The Age, and I think especially because the state government was doing such a terrible job, and the Latrobe City Council was doing such a terrible job, and the mine operators were doing such a terrible job, and social cohesion was being much more negatively affected by how government services were completely failing to even communicate with the community, and that in that space what was going on both in the media and in social media was incredibly valuable, and the fact that even if the media was playing into these tropes and stereotypes, at least they were talking about the community members and the community when that just wasn't actually happening.
That's even worse, isn't it? No coverage at all, and that is an active
decision. Yeah, and just the
made
silence, just the complete silence from official sources, just the contempt of that was...
The hands are starting to rise. Get in early, folks. This is a good panel, isn't it? Here we go. Tell us who you are, ma'am.
Chris Newton from Blue Mountains in New South Wales. Two sort of common questions. One on this issue of media ethics, if you want to put it more broadly. So, in our instance, we had, and I'm happy to say none of the organisations represented here on the panel were involved, but we had certainly commercial media outlets behaving in the most outrageous fashion. So they would dress up in soot-covered, RFS gear and shove microphones through the fences around the primary school, saying, "Do you know anybody who was burnt, or were you affected?" Luckily, we got onto that pretty quickly, and they were rejected. Or door knocking the affected streets, trying to find somebody to stick a microphone under their face. So, I guess the question is there a media code of ethics that covers that kind of behaviour? First question.
Interesting. Denis is teaching those two techniques to his students, apparently.
And the second sort of comment question is, tourism is our major industry in the Blue Mountains, and even in only the first year, that summer season, for the major outlet, hospitality, tourism outlets in the Upper Mountains, they lost something like $45 million like that. because of the media representation of Blue Mountains were accompanied visually by either leaping flames or masses of hectares of burnt out bushland, which was true, but it was Lithgow. And the tourists, domestic and international, simply saw Blue Mountains equals burnt out desolation. Why would we go there? Which is back to some of the points that you guys have made. Again, is there anything in a media code of ethics that deals with that kind of representation? We had to get Prince William up to sort the issue.
I know.
Yeah,
That's your answer to everything.
You see, you play into the news value of celebrity straight away, don't you?
Yep.
Okay.
They get it.
I'll take this one because it's my bag, I suppose. No doubt atrocities happen, and I'm going to be quite outspoken about this. The source of most of them are commercial current affairs television. Okay? Don't tar everybody with that brush. After Black Saturday, I interviewed 27 survivors and 27 journalists in depth for a big qual research project. Of the 27 survivors whom I interviewed, I asked each of them the specific question: did in the end the encounter you had with the media do you more harm than good or more good than harm? And 23 out of the 27 said it did them more good than harm. And I heard many, many stories of reporters, not just from what you might think the high-end media, but from across the media, doing small acts of kindness, taking trouble not to bully people. And in fact, it turned out that that was the better way to get the story. Doing the sort of stuff you're talking about was a way to guarantee you nearly don't get the story. I remember a 73-year-old farmer at Caligny down near Traralgon telling me a story about how a young male reporter from one of the big newspapers here politely came down his driveway the morning after he'd saved his house and 9 people in it and said, "How are you? Would you mind telling me your story?" And he said, "Sure, fine, have a cup of tea." And the farmer told me that not long after that young man left, a television crew marched down the driveway with cameras up and boom microphones, and he told him to bugger off. People get it. A lot of survivors get this stuff. The code of ethics question is Clause 8 of the MEAA code, which is the national code, says that you have to respect personal privacy and grief. And Clause 2 has to do with the stuff you are concerned about diversity, about treating people with respect regardless of ethnicity and so on. So yes, there are clauses in the codes of ethics, in the code of ethics about these things. The problem is that under pressure, sometimes induced from inside the journalist, sometimes induced by the organisation they work for, or just a general rivalry, people make mistakes. But mostly, a lot of the journalists in these situations do pretty well. And that was actually reflected in a book I've just reviewed called Becoming the News by Ruth Palmer. You might be interested in reading that book. It's just coming out in America, Becoming the News. And she did 83 interviews of the kind that I did here. And she found, broadly speaking, the same patterns. So, yep, the ethics are absolutely there. As for the economic stuff, I was up in Bega at the time of the Tarthra fire recently, and I was doing some work with the ABC. I do a weekly radio broadcast on the ABC pro bono here, and did the same out of Bega. And the ABC in Bega was going out of its way to say, the roads to Tarthra are open, get down there and spend some money. Now, it's not in the code of ethics, but it's the right thing to do.
Thanks, Denis. Questions from the floor?
I have a question. This relates to the subtitle of this conference is Communities and Emergency Management Building Resilience, and one of the greatest points of impetus for this work was in the Bushfire Report, Commission Fire Report, there was a chapter on shared responsibility, and Justice Teague made it quite clear that shared responsibility doesn't mean equal responsibility. but he pointed out that not only government emergency services, but communities and individuals all had to do more. The point I just want to ask is that I do not recall any media organisation exploring that chapter at all after the Royal Commission came out. So I'm just wondering to see why that was ignored.
Can I ask, do you mean in a reporting sense?
In a reporting sense, there was a whole chapter which actually said this is actually a more complex story than who's to blame and what we need to do in the future. But so I'm just trying to see how the media can explore the complexity around some of this.
So again, I can't comment in regards to the media reporting side. But what I do know is that the ABC's emergency broadcasting really developed as a result of Black Saturday. So prior to Black Saturday, yes, ABC and other radio stations and media were jumping on air and telling people what they could during a time of emergency. But after Black Saturday, it became a much more structured process. I know that the ABC and I think another media organisation was involved at a national level with the emergency sector to try to determine, okay, in a time of severe emergency, how will we best communicate that information to the public? It was after Black Saturday that we had the emergency watch and act and advice levels. The structure in regards to the frequency of those warnings being broadcast or posted on social media or whatever, that came about as a result of Black Saturday. So while I don't know about the reporting of that report or that part of the report, I do know that good things happened and we are still building on that good work even today. Not just the ABC, absolutely not just the ABC. It is far more widely known how to best communicate with the public during a time of emergency in terms of those bare details that the public need to know. And I think that stems from Black Saturday.
That's super important for radio, isn't it? We still turn to radio in an emergency. Nick, has the Age at Fairfax changed the way it reports post-Black Saturday?
Almost certainly. If the Royal Commission would have gone to all reporters from all stations, they would have plucked the newsier stuff out of it, to use a crude term, the sexier stuff out of it. That more complicated chapter requiring a bit of thought and analysis. Number one, do we have the room to put that in the report? I didn't do the report myself, but whoever our team was, and this would be across newsrooms. Number two, I mean, it's very likely the reporters assigned to cover the finding of the Royal Commission, which delivered on one day, wouldn't even get to that ever. So, again, what I'm reflecting on sitting up here is if the people that you're influencing in your sectors, and it could be as simple as somebody on the ground in emergency services needs to be thinking somewhere, of course they've got greater priorities, but somewhere when they engage with the media, giving us a steer and saying, have you thought about how covering this or thinking about this in this different way? And I'm sure we can do that sort of organisation to organisation. We're trained by various emergency services once a year, something like that. But to actually have it a bit more embedded on the ground might be really useful as well.
I think do you want to jump to the next question?
Go for it, Tom, very quick.
In terms of the resilience piece, I think it was really interesting for me watching the Latrobe Valley community over a time span of the last 4 years. And I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with the disaster studies literature around kind of disaster communities that kind of spontaneously form, work to support communities and then kind of dissolve or splinter years later. And it was very interesting to watch that happen in the Latrobe Valley, that, in the weeks of the mine fire, especially in terms of stepping in to fill the gap of the lack of kind of government leadership, there was this incredibly sort of vibrant community. There was a massive protest. A range of organisations, including Voices of the Valley and Latrobe Valley First, came together, and there was this really kind of positive sense of really good things coming out of it. But the longer it went on and the more sort of the long tail of the disaster happened, there was then just a lack of, decline in morale, infighting, acrimonious circumstances, and the whole thing sort of splintered, and everyone sort of just back to the daily grind of everyday life, and the trauma of the fire is now just sort of mixed into the general hardship or, just everyday life stuff.
A note to our panellists and audience, we are swimming in questions. We'll have to compact both parts of the debate. Madam.
Thank you. Loretta Crowe, Emergency Management Victoria. I'm glad you picked up on the learnings from the Royal Commission, because so far we've talked about Hazelwood and Black Saturday as the past. So, and I can only speak from a Victorian context and what we're learning along the way. We now have recovery at the same time as response. So within Victoria, we set that up straight away. If I use the example of the peat fires that are currently still happening in the southwest, for those of you that don't know, we actually still have a major emergency happening in Victoria. We use the learnings out of Hazelwood to get into that community earlier and get those vulnerable people out, and the local councils, the Department of Health and Human Services working with EMV and all the other agencies are actually this cohesive unit working together from those learnings. We have a huge social media presence. Our media teams are magnificent and engage very early on with all media. We have someone in the State Control Centre every single morning doing a live cross to Sunrise or Today or whenever when there's an incident on. And Craig and the other chiefs are often frontline and centre with their Auslan interpreters doing lots and lots of social media. So I think we are learning, we are supporting each other, and I'd like to see sort of some more comments about that going forward rather than constantly focusing on the past.
You flummoxed them. With all that fancy talk about future and past, it gets complicated. I mean, you don't have to be so compact that you don't talk.
I'll
Thank
just
you, Adam.
make an observation here. I think you've spoken about a really positive outcome of disaster, and I think that we do need to really harness that. I mean, at the end of the day, we are the human condition, we are pack animals, we are tribal, so we come together. And I think that if there are a lot of positive stories in disaster, and I think there's a lot of culturally diverse stories in disaster as well, that we I guess from all of us, we need to say, how can I be informing government, how can we be influencing media where we are getting that positive story as well to be a really negative, heavy time, to help it, I think to help the healing a little bit too. Yeah. So it was a really good point.
And also just what you touched on, cutting out the middlemen, the mainstream traditional media, we're of course part of it, but using social media and digital media, really, really powerful tool to tell the stories you want to tell. And if agencies and organisations aren't doing that, they're not doing their job. So you can actually, you can influence people far more than you could have prior to the internet era. So that's a pretty exciting opportunity.
Mm. And in terms of the recovery side, recovery broadcasting is absolutely an essential part of telling that story in the after stage. And that's where we are constantly giving the information to the public that they need then, because after the flood, fire, cyclone hits, of course, that's just the start of the nightmare.
That's presuming you have that as a priority in your news organisation. Most have just moved on to the next story, the next disaster, the next sporting event. And ABC might have a much longer perspective than most.
Yeah, quite possibly, because again, that is bread and butter of recovery broadcasting. You know, we're doing that in Tathra right now. We probably won't do it in southwestern Sydney after the weekend's fires because it's not the same degree of impact. But absolutely, we go into the communities, and in terms of the social cohesion question and the Blue Mountains question, our recovery broadcasters will put their microphones in front of people, and I've been a recovery broadcaster, and we will ask questions like, how has your community helped you through this time? What would you say about your friends and family and the way that they are helping you get back on track? So it's, yes, telling a story, but also planting a seed in the minds of the people being interviewed. Yeah, we are coming together, aren't we? Yeah, we can do this. We face some pretty tough stuff, and it's not going to end tomorrow, but together we can do it.
Many questions.
Wendy Graham, I'm the Director for Resilience and Recovery in New South Wales. I'm really pleased to hear you talking about Tathra, and I have more of a comment to support this conversation rather than a question. One of the things that we've recognised in New South Wales is our relationship with you as the media is one of the most important relationships that we can have. What we've done in New South Wales is really made a parallel structure which we've had for a long time in response, in terms of we have appointed at a state level a recovery public information officer, and the role of that officer is to work with the media, and it's because we've recognised that communications in recovery isn't about pulling in a comms person from the Department of Lands to give the recovery team a bit of a hand when we're in a disaster. It's actually about building a capability that understands how important comms and media is in this space. And it's great to hear your comments about TAFRA, because TAFRA is where we have really put this into place for the first time in terms of reaching out, working with the media, getting those key messages out that are really important. And so it was just a comment to say, I think that what we are doing in New South Wales, in this event, we are starting to really see that come into place. So that's very confirming.
Wendy, can I ask you a question? How's it working? I mean, can you tell us, ABC Southeast picking up on this? What about, tell us how it's working out.
It's working really, really well. They absolutely are. We're in contact with them almost daily. And so it's a very much of a proactive contact to keep them informed. When we hear things messages are going awry in the community, we'll get onto ABC and say, can you promote this, can you do this? And they're absolutely responsive and they're doing a fantastic job, as have the community radio station as well.
Right behind you. Helen.
Thank you very much. My question is a bit of a two-parter, but I guess the publishing and verbally publishing, for those who are on the radio, the first part, will you go away from this conference and actually publish any sort of story about what you've, I guess, taken away from this conference? And for those of you who perhaps are not active publishers, will you actually talk to your colleagues in your organisations to see how perhaps you can change a little bit of a mindset and raise awareness around some of the issues that we're talking about here?
Yes, how will you...
I'll definitely tweet about it.
Well, that's
twice or three times.
Yesterday, I was constantly writing notes. Now, I'm no longer a journalist. I'm behind the scenes, but I like to think of myself as an influencer with the emergency team, as the head of that emergency team. So some of the messages I got from yesterday, and I'm sure they'll just expand today, are about how can we, in times of emergency, absolutely connect with the different parts of Australia, the different parts of communities. I mean, the true aim for the ABC at the moment, and particularly over the past 3 years, has been to look and sound like modern Australia. And we're not there yet. We're trying, and in my personal opinion, we've probably left the run too late. I think we should have been trying a lot earlier. But the main thing is we are absolutely having that as our main focus now. So some of the things we are already doing, we broadcast warnings in some of the Indigenous languages in the top end of Australia. In Cyclone Marcus, I listened to a cyclone warning being broadcast in Creole, and it was wonderful to hear. When we broadcast heatwave warnings, we identify those people most at risk. We point out the very young, the elderly, drug users and others. But I think we absolutely need to do more. I mean, how can we pass messages, and it's emergency broadcasting messages, so those times of life and death, how can we ensure that all Australians have access to those messages? If you are not from an English-speaking background, who are you going to turn to? How will you know about the history of that river that you've decided to live alongside? How can we make sure that each and every Australian, whether their family has been here for generations or only a few weeks, how can we ensure that we are actively helping everyone? And we need to do more.
Yeah, well, speaking for myself, I devote about a quarter of my course at the University of Melbourne, which is a course in media ethics and media law. About a quarter of the course is devoted to dealing with traumatised and vulnerable people, self-care, which is very important. Journalists suffer from vicarious trauma very commonly, and reporting on suicide and mental illness. That's quite a big chunk of the course. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Tom's story about that woman who was sick, who had poisoned vegetables, no water supply, and I'm going to be awakening my students to that aspect of disaster reporting so that they may go looking for those stories where I wouldn't have dreamt of even mentioning it before.
Can I just pick up on the second part of that question, which I think is a great one, but I want to throw it back at the entire room here, because there are only 5 of us and there are hundreds of you. You're disaster experts. Why don't you write some journalism about it? Journalism's not that hard.
Where's it going to run, Tom?
Being an expert in disaster stuff is really difficult.
Tom,
but and there are lots of places like The Conversation. There are lots of places where you can pitch freelance articles to. That's increasingly, a model for journalism. So I'd very encourage all of you people with expertise to think about this being a two-way street. If you're not satisfied with the standard of journalism, do it yourself.
I do think Nick's idea of a panel at a gathering of journalists, reversing the numbers here, would be a terrific idea. Folks, I apologise in advance, we're not going to get to everyone's questions, but we're still trying.
Thanks. John Richardson from Red Cross. I'm interested in the panel's views on the citizen journalists, and I guess we've just heard a little bit about that, and the role of citizen journalists in sort of reporting, but also the other side is the sort of curation of the move to sort of curation of news, and where that, where the boundaries lie there, where we potentially see so tweets just kind of reposted as kind of facts or situations, and what that impact might be.
Just make a really quick point too on citizen journalism, and even when we had the Burke Street incident last year, there was a lot of misinformation flying around as well. So sometimes it can actually do well. In those situations where you have, say, a lead agency, which was Victoria Police, trying to run and contain and do whatever they need to do through their processes, that actually does not help. In those, you didn't know if do you have active shooters still around? What are you moving mass gatherings? Are you moving people in and out? And we had the incident where it wasn't a terrorist-related incident, but people were calling it a terrorist-related incident on social media, and that has a whole level of ramifications as well for communities that we need to address. So there's light and dark in those situations, I think.
Can I just ask, Nick, because you're on the ground, mate, I would myself just treat stuff like that as raw material. I mean, I wouldn't be publishing that stuff till I'd verified it. Is that where you go?
Yeah, I mean, no one would. I think in this era of fake news, it might be easy to think that the media is reporting a tweet as if it's a fact, but I don't see that happening. Maybe it happens in some extremes, but it tends not to happen. Citizen journalism doesn't. It used to be. I heard about it 10 years ago, and it was an exciting term. It doesn't really exist. I don't think. There are freelancers and there are people pushing stuff out there, but it's not really happening. Not that I'd noticed as well. But so there is. I mean, while I've got maybe I'm more cynical about the media than many, and I think I also want to recognise that journalists are at their core, even if you're working for a crappy commercial something or other, are decent people trying to do a decent job. And so at a human level, the interaction people out on the ground get, be you an emergency services worker or be you someone who's endured a fire, it tends to be pretty positive because we're human dealing with a human in a tough situation. But I still think there's a hell of a lot more we can do. Me going back to work and telling my colleagues or writing a story about it is not going to institute the cultural change. And in fact, what you guys are trying to get us to do, it's harder for this to happen now and in the next 10 years than ever before, because there's less journalists, there's less training. The media, in many respects, in terms of quality control, is getting poorer and poorer. So that's why I think you've got to be pretty inventive and come up with your own social media strategies, have your guys on the ground, knowing to push journalists here and there, because journalists do, we will be happy to be pushed, not too hard, but so I think it's a challenge, and we're going to have to be led rather than thinking we're going to have that cultural change at the coalface.
And I think also, we just have to accept, whether it's organisations or the media, that the audience is changing. Once upon a time, people would turn on to the news at a certain time on their TV. They would go out and buy paper newspapers. They would switch on the radio at set times. All of that's been thrown out the window. We know from our own habits and as a mass group, things are changing in the way that people come to stories and content that they're after. They want it at the time that they want it, and they want it delivered in that particular way. Now, in emergencies, we're seeing a lot of the community Facebook groups suddenly pop up. We're seeing 365 days a week, groups like the Storm Chasers develop their websites. They're not official agencies, but we can't just ignore them. We have to be mindful of them. And I know that AFAC, the national umbrella group for the emergency sector, is currently writing the handbook for warnings. I'm part of that working group, and I know absolutely we're thinking about those Facebook groups, we're thinking about the Storm Chasers, we're thinking about the other citizen journalists, as well as the already established media organisations. And in an emergency, whether it's the ABC or QFES or CFA or whatever the organisation is, when we hear that there's a big Facebook group, like in Sydney on the weekend, there was a Facebook group with the postcode of whether it was Menai or that region, and that really snowballed. Well, we shouldn't try to be afraid of it. We should say, if that's where the audience is, how can we, as an emergency broadcaster or as the emergency sector, help to engage that group? And that might be we join them, rather than just trying to get those people to join us.
It is a big assumption, of course, that this community-based spontaneous media will be off high-quality reporting, high ethics, no agenda. That's a nice presumption to make, but it's a bit convenient. I'm not saying that you're making that at all. You're aware of that. Final question, madam.
Thank you. Ruth McGowan. I come from a little rural town called Gindervik. I led my community through the Black Saturday disaster as mayor. I now work in local government and I'm a CFA Volt. I want to challenge the media, and I want to ask you to get rid of that term political correct from your lexicon. This is about using words wisely. Whenever I hear that term, I see it as a pejorative term for putting down all the great work that's done here in this community with policies and plans and people in action. So it's lazy, and I'm just calling bullshit on it, and use the word respect instead of politically correct.
I think the panel has just copped a spray for a word that I used. Ruth.
Yeah, that's right.
We didn't use that
That's
word.
right, Copper. Bang on.
I'll own up to that.
Thank you for owning that, Brett. That was you.
Thank you. Because, and what I was getting at too is that there is politeness and respect, but political correctness can also mean not calling out a community group that's not doing a good job because they're a community group, or not declaring a group to be negligent, even though we might be sort of prone to be sympathetic to that group if they are negligent. That's what I was getting at. The poor panel. You must have some thoughts on that. That injustice, Ruth.
I think in terms of the media, that much of the media, the Age is criticised for being, we're on your side here, we're being too gender aware. So it's used by sort of conservatives as a tool to whack people over the head. It certainly doesn't. We're not for a moment at the ABC or Fairfax, or I must say, most people at News Limited aren't part of that little culture war. That the problem is those people involved in that little culture war get a huge amount of airplay, so it does pollute the environment. But I'm on board with you. I say here, and but it's not as bad perhaps as you might think.
Yeah, no, I'm with Nick on that, and I'm with you on that. I mean, this term political correctness is used as a stick to beat one side of politics by the other side, and I'm absolutely with you that it's about respectfulness. You refer to people in terms that are not demeaning, and if people want to call that political correct, let's let them do it. But it's not.
Folks, please thank our panellists. Denis Muller, Nick McKenzie, Tom Doig, Sascha Rundle and Anna Parle. Thank you, panellists, one and all. You are now released back into the wild.
Thanks, mate. Thank you.
Excellent panel. Veronica, that was pretty tough. All right.